Before the most anticipated wedding in the Seoul underworld, Song Jin-ho, the iron-fisted leader of the Song Syndicate, decided to perform a final, silent test on his socialite fiancée, Alicia Arnold. To the world, Jin-ho had departed for a high-stakes meeting in Tokyo. In reality, he never left the mansion. Hidden within a soundproof surveillance suite deep beneath the estate, Jin-ho sat in a high-back leather chair, the pale blue flicker of 12 security monitors illuminating the sharp tattoos on his neck. For years, he used this room to hunt traitors and orchestrate the downfall of rival clans. But tonight, the target was the woman he had promised to make the queen of his empire. What he saw through those lenses would leave the city's most feared man paralyzed with rage. But it wasn't just his fiancée's betrayal that shocked him. It was the quiet, heroic defiance of a young maid named Wendy Campbell that would change his cold heart forever. You won't believe the truth that came to light when the cameras started rolling. The silence of the monitoring room was heavy. Jin-ho closed his eyes for a moment, hearing his mother Mi-young's frail, trembling voice from the night before. Jin-ho, a person's true face is only shown to those they think are beneath them. Watch her when the dragon is away. He had dismissed her fears as the symptoms of her Parkinson's, but the seed of doubt had grown too large to ignore. On the center screen, the mansion's massive oak doors swung shut. Alicia stood in the foyer, draped in an elegant dark green gown, dabbing at a stray tear as she waved goodbye to Jin-ho's phantom motorcade. Her voice, caught by the high-sensitivity microphones, was a honeyed whisper. "Stay safe, my love. My heart goes with you." Then it happened. As soon as the deadbolt clicked, Alicia's face transformed. The warmth vanished, replaced by an expression so sharp and predatory it made Jin-ho's blood run cold. She didn't head to the chapel to pray. She didn't go to check on his mother. Instead, she spat on the marble floor he had just walked across. "Finally," she hissed, pulling a burner phone from her silk clutch. "The dog is off his leash. Send the car. We have a lot of cleaning to do before he gets back, starting with that useless old woman upstairs." Jin-ho watched, motionless as a statue, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the armrests of his chair. He had spent his life reading people, but he realized he had been staring at a masterpiece of a lie. On the screen, the mansion gates opened, and a car he didn't recognize, a sleek silver rival vehicle, slid up the driveway. The game had begun, and Jin-ho was the only one who knew the rules had changed. The digital clocks on the wall ticked in unison, a rhythmic pulse that felt like a countdown to an explosion. Jin-ho's eyes remained fixed on the main monitor, where the heavy front doors of the Song estate creaked open once more. Alicia didn't wait in the foyer. Instead, she strode out to the driveway to meet a man stepping out of a silver Mercedes, a man Jin-ho recognized instantly. It was Kenji Sato, the ambitious underboss of a rival syndicate that had been nipping at the Song family's borders for months. Jin-ho's jaw tightened until the muscles ached. Watching them walk side by side into his home felt like watching a virus enter a healthy body. They didn't go to a secluded corner. They marched straight into the grand living room, the heart of the mansion where Jin-ho's father had once held council. Alicia threw herself onto the velvet sofa, crossing her legs with a sense of ownership that made Jin-ho's skin crawl. "You should have seen him, Kenji." Alicia laughed, the sound sharp and metallic through the speakers. "He actually looked sad to leave me." The great Song Jin-ho, reduced to a lovesick puppy by a bit of blonde hair and a few practiced tears. Sato poured himself a glass of Jin-ho's finest vintage whiskey, swirling the amber liquid with a smug grin. "He's grown soft, Alicia, obsessing over that dying old woman and her traditions. He's forgotten that in this world, if you don't keep your boot on someone's neck, they'll slit your throat." Alicia leaned back, her eyes gleaming with a terrifying coldness. "He thinks this wedding is the beginning of our life together. He has no idea it's the funeral for his empire. Once the papers are signed and the assets are merged, he becomes redundant." They laughed together, a jarring sound that echoed in the empty hall. They began to mock the very house they stood in, pointing at the traditional Korean artworks Jin-ho's mother had curated, calling them clutter and relics of a weak culture. Alicia stood up and walked over to a porcelain vase, a Ming Dynasty piece that had been in the Song family for generations. She traced the rim with a predatory fingernail. "I'm going to sell all this junk the moment the ink is dry," she sneered. "And the mother queen downstairs? She's the first thing to go. I'm not spending my nights listening to her cough." Sato stood and moved behind her, his hands settling on the shoulders Jin-ho had kissed only hours ago. "To the fall of the dragon," he toasted, raising his glass to the hidden camera. Jin-ho watched, his breath shallow and controlled. He didn't scream. He didn't rush out. He sat in the darkness of the secret room, a silent predator recording every insult, every plan, and every betrayal. His heart was no longer crushing. It was turning into stone. He needed to see more. He needed to see exactly how far their cruelty went. The shadows in the surveillance room seemed to deepen as Alicia stormed out of the living room, her high heels striking the marble floor like the beat of a war drum. Sato followed at a distance, a cruel, expectant smirk playing on his lips. Jinho's pulse thundered in his ears as he switched the feed to his mother's bedroom. Inside the quiet sanctuary, Song Mi-young sat in her chair by the window, her small frame wrapped in a floral cardigan. She was trembling, a side effect of the Parkinson's that had stolen her strength, but not her dignity. Wendy was there, kneeling beside her, gently rubbing the elderly woman's stiff hands and whispering words of comfort that the microphones barely caught. The peace was shattered when the door flew open, rebounding off the wall with a violent crash. Alicia marched in, her dark green gown swirling around her like a poisonous mist. Still clutching that old rag's hand. "Are you?" she hissed at Wendy. She turned her venomous gaze to Mi-young, who looked up with eyes clouded by fear. "I'm sick of the smell of medicine and old age in this house. You've had your time, you withered fossil. Why don't you just stop fighting and fade away?" Mi-young tried to speak, her voice a mere rasp. "Jinho, he loves. Jinho isn't here to save you now." Alicia shrieked, her face contorting into a mask of pure rage. Driven by a sudden, psychotic impulse, she pulled back her leg, the sharp heel of her shoe aimed directly at the elderly woman's fragile chest. In the secret room, Jinho surged to his feet, a roar of primal fury trapped in his throat. But on the screen, something incredible happened. When he didn't scream or run, with a speed born of pure instinct, she threw herself across Mi-young's lap. The heavy thud of the kick landing against Wendy's ribs echoed through the audio monitors. Wendy gasped, her face contorting in agony as she took the full force of the blow intended for the mother. She didn't let go. Instead, she wrapped her arms even tighter around Mi-young, shielding her body with her own. "Get out!" Wendy managed to choke out, looking up at Alicia with a gaze that burned through the screen. There was no fear in the maid's eyes now, only a fierce, protective fire. "You will not touch her. Not while I'm breathing." Alicia recoiled, shocked by the defiance of a girl she considered invisible. Sato stood in the doorway, laughing softly at the entertainment. Jinho sank back into his chair, his hands shaking as he watched Wendy cradle his sobbing mother. He had spent his life surrounded by men who claimed to be brave, but he had never seen courage quite like this. In the heart of his own home, a girl with nothing was protecting the only thing he had left to love. After Alicia and Sato retreated, their mocking laughter echoing down the corridor, a heavy, bruised silence settled over the room. Jinho sat in the dark, his breath hitching as he watched the monitor. Wendy remained on the floor for a long time, her forehead pressed against Mi-young's knees, her small frame shivering from the lingering adrenaline and the pain in her side. When she finally looked up, she didn't check her own injury. Instead, she reached up to wipe a stray tear from the elderly woman's wrinkled cheek. "It's okay, Iamonim," Wendy whispered. The word hit Jinho like a physical blow. Iamonim, the formal, respectful Korean term for mother. He watched, mesmerized, as Wendy slowly helped his mother to the small kitchen area attached to the suite. Her movements were practiced and full of a grace he had never noticed before. She moved with a quiet purpose, reaching for a tin of sangwa cha, the traditional medicinal tea his mother had loved since he was a child. With steady hands, Wendy prepared the tea, her lips moving in a soft, melodic hum. Jinho leaned closer to the audio receiver, his heart hammering against his ribs. It wasn't a song from the radio. It was a Korean lullaby, a folk song his mother used to sing to him in the slums of Busan before the song name meant anything at all. Wendy's pronunciation wasn't perfect, but the soul behind the notes was unmistakable. She had learned his language, his flavors, and his mother's heart, all while being treated as a nameless shadow in the background of his life. "Drink, Iamonim," Wendy said softly, blowing on the steaming cup before holding it to Mi-young's lips. "The herbs will help the trembling. Jinho will be home soon. He is a good son. He wouldn't leave you if he knew." Mi-young took a sip, her shaking hands steadied by Wendy's firm grip. For the first time in months, the fear in his mother's eyes faded, replaced by a look of profound maternal love directed at the girl who was supposed to be a stranger. In the cold, blue light of the surveillance room, Jinho felt a burning sensation in his eyes that he hadn't experienced since his father's funeral. He had searched the world for a woman worthy of the song name, looking at bloodlines and bank accounts, only to find that the true queen of his house was the one who knelt on the kitchen floor, humming the songs of his ancestors to a woman everyone else had forgotten. He had been blind, but as he watched Wendy lean in to kiss his mother's hand, the scales didn't just fall, they shattered. The deep hush of the mansion at night was usually a comfort to Jinho, but now it felt like a suffocating weight. As his mother drifted into a tea-induced sleep, when he finally stepped away from the bedside, She retreated to the small, cramped staff pantry, her shoulders slumped in a way that betrayed her exhaustion. Jinho adjusted the audio gain on his console, the static hissing in his ears as Wendy pulled a battered smartphone from her apron pocket. Her hands were shaking. She dialed a number with trembling fingers, and after a few agonizing rings, a young, frail voice answered. "Hey sis, you still at the big house?" "I'm here, Marcus," Wendy whispered, her voice cracking. She leaned her head against the cold tile of the wall, closing her eyes. "How are you feeling? Did the doctors come by today?" Jinho leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. On the other end of the line, the boy's voice was thin, punctuated by the rhythmic beep of a hospital monitor. "They said the dialysis is getting harder. They asked about the deposit for the transplant list again. I told them we're almost there." A single tear tracked through the dust and sweat on Wendy's cheek. "We are almost there, baby. I'm working a double shift tonight, and the lady of the house, she's giving me a bonus for extra duties." Jinho's stomach turned. He knew what that bonus was. It was the hush money Alicia threw at Wendy after the physical abuse, a pittance given to ensure her silence. Wendy wasn't staying in this den of vipers out of fear or lack of ambition. She was staying because she was the only thing standing between her brother and a grave. "Don't push yourself too hard, Wendy," Marcus said, his voice fading. "I don't want you to get hurt." "I'm fine, Marcus. I'm strong. I've got the Song family protecting me," she lied, her voice steadying with a heartbreaking bravery. "Go to sleep. I'll have the money by the weekend. I promise." When she hung up, Wendy didn't sob. She simply tucked the phone away, splashed cold water on her face, and checked her reflection in a small, cracked mirror. She adjusted her headband, hiding the faint bruise forming near her temple from Alicia's earlier assault. In the surveillance room, Jinho felt a different kind of shame. He had prided himself on knowing every detail of his organization, every debt owed, every bullet spent. Yet, he had been blind to the war being fought in his own kitchen. This girl was a soldier, more loyal and resilient than his most seasoned enforcers. She was carrying the weight of two families on her back, while his supposed fiancée was busy trying to burn them both down. He looked at the bank details on a separate monitor, his finger hovering over the keyboard. The fourth day dawned with a deceptive stillness. From his hidden sanctuary, Jinho watched as Alicia entered the kitchen, her movements sharp and predatory. She bypassed the breakfast trays and went straight to the medicine cabinet where his mother's specialized Parkinson's regimen was kept. With a casual, chilling indifference, Alicia swept the evening's vials into the palm of her hand and dropped them into the waste bin, burying them beneath layers of coffee grounds. "A long sleep is exactly what this house needs," Alicia murmured to herself, a twisted smile playing on her lips. She then turned her attention to a pot of tea brewing on the stove, deliberately omitting the crushed herbal supplements the doctors had mandated to prevent Mi-young's tremors from escalating into respiratory distress. Jinho's hand surged toward the intercom, his heart thundering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He was seconds away from storming out and ending the charade, but then he saw Wendy. She was standing in the shadows of the pantry, her eyes wide and fixed on Alicia's retreating back. She had seen everything. Wendy waited until the clicking of Alicia's heels faded toward the sunroom. Without a moment's hesitation, the young maid moved. She didn't panic. She worked with a frantic, focused precision. Jinho watched as she knelt by the bin, her fingers digging through the refuse until she retrieved the discarded vials. Her hands were shaking, but her resolve was iron. She knew the schedule by heart. She knew that without this dose, Mi-young's lungs might seize before the sun set. Wendy quickly prepared a fresh cup of tea, her eyes darting toward the door as she stirred in the life-saving medicine. Just as she was placing the cup on a silver tray, Alicia reappeared, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. "What are you doing?" "I already prepared the tea for the old woman," Alicia snapped, stepping closer with an intimidating grace. Wendy kept her head low, her voice a humble murmur that hid the storm raging inside her. "I'm sorry, Miss Arnold. I thought I saw a bit of leaf in the other pot. I didn't want the mistress to choke." Alicia let out a short, derisive laugh. "Fine. Take it to her. It won't make a difference anyway. She's already halfway to the grave." As Wendy carried the tray into Mi-young's room, Jinho sank back into his chair, his forehead pressed against the cool glass of the monitor. He watched Wendy gently lift his mother's head, whispering a prayer as she helped her drink. The maid wasn't just preserving a life. She was preserving the last shred of Jinho's humanity. He looked at the discarded coffee grounds on the screen, and then at the girl who was risking everything to fix a world she didn't even own. The debt he owed Wendy was no longer financial. It was a debt of blood. By late afternoon, the tension inside the Song mansion had thickened into a suffocating fog. Alicia was pacing the sunroom, her eyes darting toward the hallway every few minutes. She was waiting for the news, waiting for the panicked cry that Mi-young had stopped breathing. But when the hour passed and the house remained silent, her frustration boiled into a manic rage. She stormed toward the bedroom, her silk gown hissing against the floor like a viper in the grass. Inside, the scene was one of quiet, defiant peace. Wendy was sitting on the edge of the bed, slowly brushing Mi-young's silver hair, hummed the melody of the Busan lullaby. The elderly woman's color had returned, her breathing rhythmic and strong. Alicia froze in the doorway, her face contorting as she realized her attempt to speed up the inheritance had been thwarted. Her eyes fell on the empty teacup on the nightstand, and then on Wendy's calm, knowing expression. "You," Alicia whispered, the word trembling with a murderous edge. "You think you're so clever, don't you? You think you've won some little game?" She crossed the room in 3 blurred strides. Before Wendy could even set down the brush, Alicia's hand lashed out. The slap cracked through the room like a gunshot. Wendy's head snapped to the side, the force of the blow sending her stumbling against the bed frame. Mi-young let out a choked, terrified cry, her frail hands clutching at the air. In the surveillance room, Jin-ho surged out of his chair so violently it toppled over. His hand was on the door handle, his vision tunneling into a red haze of pure, lethal instinct. But he stopped. He saw Wendy slowly straighten her back. Wendy didn't cower. She didn't burst into tears or beg for mercy as Alicia expected. Instead, she turned her face back toward Alicia, her cheek blooming with a deep, angry crimson. She wiped a small trickle of blood from the corner of her mouth and looked the blonde socialite directly in the eye. Her gaze was steady, cold, and possessed a moral weight that made Alicia actually flinch. "I am the only one in this house who remembers what honor looks like," Wendy said, her voice low and vibrating with an unbreakable power. "You can strike me 1,000 times, Miss Arnold, but I will not leave her, and I will not stop protecting her from you." Alicia lunged forward, her fingers clawing at Wendy's throat. "I'll have you thrown in a gutter. I'll make sure your brother rots in that hospital bed." Wendy didn't flinch. "Then we will rot together. But as long as I am standing, you will not touch this mother." Jin-ho watched, his breath caught in his throat. He saw the marks of his own world, the violence, the threats, the cruelty, being absorbed by a girl who had no weapons but her soul. He realized then that he didn't need to wait for Sicily. The trial was over. He reached for his phone and dialed his head of security. "Prepare the dining room," Jin-ho commanded, his voice a low, terrifying growl. "And bring the manager. It's time for the dragon to come home." The gravel of the driveway crunched under the tires of the black Rolls-Royce, a sound that usually signaled the return of the king, but today it felt like the tolling of a funeral bell. From her window, Alicia's face drained of color before she quickly rearranged her features into a mask of joyful surprise. She practically sprinted toward the foyer, smoothing her hair and adjusting her gown, her heart hammering with the thrill of a predator who thought she had successfully hidden her kill. "Jin-ho, my love, you're back so soon," Alicia cried, throwing herself into his arms as he stepped through the door. She pressed her face against his neck, breathing in the scent of his expensive cologne, unaware that the man holding her felt like a statue carved from dry ice. Jin-ho didn't speak. He didn't return the embrace with his usual warmth. He simply placed his large, tattooed hands on her shoulders and stepped back, his eyes unreadable. "I finished my business early, Alicia. I missed my family. I've arranged a special dinner for us tonight, in the grand dining hall." Alicia's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "A dinner? Just us, and my mother, and Wendy," Jin-ho added, his voice low and dangerous. "They are the pillars of this house, are they not?" Half an hour later, the atmosphere in the dining room was thick enough to choke. Alicia sat to Jin-ho's right, still trying to play the doting fiancé, while Sato, who had been introduced as a casual guest, sat sweating across from them. Wendy stood by Mi-young's wheelchair, her face pale, the bruise on her cheek poorly hidden by her hair. "You look troubled, Alicia," Jin-ho remarked, swirling a glass of deep red wine. "Is it the house? Or perhaps the secrets kept within it?" "I don't know what you mean, darling," she laughed nervously. Jin-ho set his glass down with a sharp clack that echoed like a gunshot. "Let me show you. I found some very interesting security footage during my trip." He pressed a button on a small remote. The 100-inch screen at the end of the hall, usually reserved for stock markets and territory maps, flickered to life. The room went deathly silent. Alicia's own voice filled the air, shrill and hateful, as the monitor showed her screaming at Mi-young. Then came the image that stopped her heart, Alicia's high heels swinging toward the elderly woman, and Wendy throwing her body into the line of fire. Alicia gasped, her fork clattering onto her porcelain plate. "Jin-ho, that's not what it looks like. It's a misunderstanding." The screen shifted to the kitchen, showing Alicia dumping the medication into the trash with a wicked smirk. Jinho turned his head slowly toward her, his eyes burning with the fires of a man who had seen his soul's sanctuary violated. The dragon hadn't just come home. He had brought the fire with him. The dining room was a tomb of suffocating silence, broken only by the rhythmic, mechanical sound of the surveillance footage looping on the massive screen. Alicia's face was the color of ash, her mouth opening and closing as she looked from the screen to the cold, dead eyes of the man beside her. Sato attempted to push back his chair, his hand creeping toward the inner pocket of his jacket, but he didn't even clear the table. Two of Jinho's elite enforcers, men who moved like shadows in the night, appeared from the corners of the room. Before Sato could draw his breath, his arms were pinned behind his back, his face slammed into the mahogany table. Alicia let out a piercing shriek as a third man gripped her by the shoulders, forcing her to stand. Jinho, please. I was doing it for us. She was a burden. She was holding you back. Alicia screamed, her voice cracking with a desperate, ugly terror. Jinho stood slowly, his presence expanding until he seemed to fill the entire hall. He didn't look at her with anger. He looked at her with the clinical detachment one might show a poisonous insect. You weren't removing a burden, Alicia. You were attempting to murder the only heart this family has left. He turned his gaze to Sato, who was groveling against the wood. And you thought the song name had grown soft. You'll find that the dragon still knows how to burn. With a sharp flick of his wrist, Jinho gave the command. Alicia's screams faded into muffled sobs as she and Sato were dragged out of the grand hall, destined for a basement where the law did not reach and mercy did not exist. As the heavy doors thudded shut, the violence left the room, leaving only a hollow, aching quiet. Jinho turned toward the end of the table. Wendy stood there, her hand still resting protectively on Mi-young's shoulder, her head bowed, as if she were waiting for the next blow. Jinho walked toward them, his heavy footsteps echoing on the marble. He stopped inches from Wendy. For a long moment, the most powerful man in the city simply looked at her, at the bruise on her cheek, the exhaustion in her eyes, and the sheer, radiant goodness she had maintained in a house of monsters. Then, the unthinkable happened. Song Jinho, a man who had never bowed to any rival or authority, lowered his head. He bent his body into a deep, formal bow, his forehead nearly touching his knees. I have spent my life looking for enemies in the dark, Jinho said, his voice thick with a raw, humored vulnerability. And because of that, I was blind to the light standing right in front of me. You protected my mother when I was too foolish to see she was in danger. You took the strikes meant for her. I didn't see you, Wendy. I treated you like a shadow, while you were the only one acting with the honor of a song. Wendy looked up, her eyes wide and shimmering with tears. She had spent her life being invisible, but in the reflection of Jinho's gaze, she finally saw herself, not as a maid, but as a hero. The cherry blossoms were in full bloom, casting a soft pink canopy over the Song Estate's private garden. A year had passed since the night the monitors revealed the truth, but the mansion felt as though it had been reborn in a different era. The cold, sterile silence that once defined the halls had been replaced by the sound of laughter and the fragrant steam of sangwucha drifting through the open windows. Song Mi-young sat in the front row, her traditional hanbok shimmering in the sunlight. Her hands still trembled slightly, but the fear was gone, replaced by a radiant pride. Beside her stood Wendy's brother, Marcus, looking healthy and strong after a successful transplant funded by the man he now called a brother. The music shifted, a beautiful, haunting blend of traditional Korean strings and soulful gospel melodies. At the end of the aisle stood Song Jinho. The sharp, icy edge of his gaze had softened into something profound and steady. He no longer wore the look of a man watching for traitors. He looked like a man who had finally found home. Then, the garden went silent as Wendy appeared. She was no longer draped in the blue and white uniform of a shadow. She wore a gown that was a masterpiece of two worlds, ivory silk embroidered with delicate plum blossoms and intricate patterns that honored her own heritage. She walked with the same quiet strength she had shown when she was a human shield, but today, her head was held high. When she reached Jinho, he didn't wait for the vows to take her hands. He held them with a reverence that told the story of the past year, of how she had taught him that true power wasn't found in fear, but in the courage to protect the vulnerable. A year ago, I was a man who lived behind walls, Jinho said, his voice carrying clearly across the garden. I thought my legacy was built on shadows. But Wendy showed me that a house is only as strong as the love that guards its gates. She wasn't just the heart of this home when I was too blind to see it. She is the future of the song name. As they exchanged rings, the guests, a mix of high-ranking associates who now respected a different kind of leadership and Wendy's own family, rose in a standing ovation. Wendy looked out at the garden, then at Mi-young, who blew her a kiss. The maid who had once knelt on the floor to take a blow for a stranger was now the matriarch of the city's most powerful family. The dragon had found its fire, and for the first time in generations, the Song legacy wasn't written in blood, but in the unbreakable bond of a family chosen by heart.